Hi everyone. Today we are reading 1 Kings 8 and 2 Chronicles 5. In 2 Chronicles 5 and the first part of 1 Kings 8, we read about the Ark of the Covenant being brought from the tabernacle in Jerusalem to the temple. Solomon's major building projects have been completed, the temple and his palace, and the moment has finally arrived where God will appear in the dwelling that he promised to David. And it's quite an event. This occurred during the Feast of Tabernacles. So all the men of Israel were already going to be in Jerusalem. Solomon called together all the elders, leaders, and priests of Israel, and they brought the ark up according to the method that God commanded through Moses. There was no issue this time with the ark falling or someone touching it that shouldn't have, as there had been in the past. It was done correctly. In 1 Kings 8, it mentions sacrifices of sheep and oxen on two different occasions. This was a peace offering. And the first one was as the ark is being carried to the temple, and the other after Solomon's speeches. In the first one, it says that the number of sheep and oxen could not be counted. But in the second instance, it says there were 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. That's 142,000 total animals. Now, it could be the case that maybe those are the same sacrifice, just described two different times. I don't think so. I think that would be a contradiction, because in the first case it says it couldn't be counted, and then in the second case it counts them as 142,000. So I think those are two separate, very large sacrifices on the same day. And that's a lot of animals to be slaughtered in that sacrifice. In fact, it said, if they could count 142,000 animals, you got to figure that 142,000 on that second, the second sacrifice, but the first time it's got to be greater than that. If they could count the 142 the first time or the second time, then that first time there must be more than that. So let's say greater than 142,000, right? And you add those together, it's got to be greater than 284,000. So just by rounding up, you're looking at over 300,000 animals, sheep and oxen, being sacrificed on that day. Now, I think it's probably even more than that, because if they were just slightly above 142,000, they probably would have counted that. So perhaps it was even greater. And in fact, you might round that up to say, maybe 400,000 or so, animals were, sacrificed on that day. A lot in either case. It's a lot of animals. And so the Levites, they finally get the ark to the temple, and 2 Chronicles describes a large number of singers. The singers have cymbals and other instruments, and also there's 120 trumpeters, and they're all raising a song to God. So this is a lot of people with a lot of instruments, and they're singing, "For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." And at that incredible sound, the glory of the Lord fills the temple for the first time in the form of a cloud. This cloud is so overwhelming that it knocks all the priests out of the area. At this point, Solomon begins a series of speeches, and these take us through the rest of 1 Kings 8, which is quite a long chapter. He begins by explaining to all Israel that God is fulfilling a promise that he made to David to build this temple. God had not wanted to favor any city or tribe by putting his permanent dwelling there. But because of his relationship with David, he selected the city of David, Jerusalem, for his home. Solomon then says a prayer to God in which he acknowledges God's faithfulness to complete the building of the temple. He then asks God to remain faithful to his other promises, blessing the people of Israel as long as they continue to walk in his commands. I love how Solomon here expresses God's uncontainable glory when he says, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, how much less this house that I have built. It is as though Solomon realizes how silly it must be that God would need an earthly house to dwell in. However, he goes on in most of the rest of the prayer to say that it is not really for God's sake, but for the people's sake. They need a place to pray to and to visit when they make their requests and offer their sacrifices. The temple could also be seen as a way for man to honor God rather than give God something that he needed. I think Paul puts it very elegantly while speaking in Athens in Acts chapter 17, when he says, "The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything." And interestingly, earlier in the book of Acts, Stephen, whom Paul stoned before his conversion, concluded his speech with this very point and quoted Isaiah the prophet also, saying, "But it was Solomon who built a house for him. Yet the Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands, as the prophet says, 'Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Did not my hand make all these things?'" You guys, God is the creator of the universe. He is infinite, he's eternal, and mighty. You can't contain him. No one can contain him anywhere by anyone. Yet he allowed Solomon to build this temple, and he chose to dwell in it for the sake of the people. Even though God put on an amazing show in coming down in the cloud and consuming the offerings with fire, this was, in my opinion, an act of humility on his part. He was demonstrating some power, yet confining himself to a building and restraining his full power. Had he shown his full glory, none of the people would have survived. What a demonstration of his compassion and mercy along with his power. It just shows God's real desire to be with his people.